They bred their own children into living corpses. That's how obsessed they were with royal blood. This royal family was so inbred, they couldn't speak or walk properly. God's chosen rulers. Holy blood. But no one wanted to admit that blood was so warped it couldn't keep a king on his feet, let alone hold an empire together. Think you know European royalty? Let's tear down the velvet curtain. Because the Habsburgs didn't just marry cousins. They engineered their dynasty like a breeding experiment in a haunted menagerie. Not a family tree. A single gnarled branch, black with rot. You're part of this investigation now. And if you want to uncover every ugly detail they tried to hide, subscribe. Stay with us. This inbred family had a motto: let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. Sounds elegant, right? Until you see, it meant uncle-niece weddings signed off by the Pope like they were trade agreements. Picture 1570. King Philip II marries Anna of Austria, his niece. Papal dispensation stamped and sold. Because Rome never met a dowry it didn't like. It wasn't politics. It was medical malpractice at the scale of an empire. So let's look closer. Heavy nursery drapes trapping the stink of sour milk and stale incense. Nurses mumbling prayers while wiping drool from jaws that wouldn't close. Lullabies for power sung over pillows damp with family failure. No court painter showed that. They used oil and gold leaf to smother the truth. Because it wasn't just ugly. It was contagious. By the 1600s, the Habsburg jaw wasn't a quirk. It was a warning sign. A chin so proud it deserved its own throne. And they called it noble, holy, all while signing marriage contracts like a priest-run Tinder for first cousins. Philip IV marrying Mariana of Austria in 1649. His niece. Another neat alliance in their tangled bramble of shared chromosomes. They didn't want you to see it for what it was. Not diplomacy. Eugenics with crowns. A conspiracy buried in church archives and wedding contracts. All to keep their empire stitched together with bedsheets instead of treaties. Austria, Spain, Naples, the Netherlands. And the blood kept getting thicker, sicker, until it produced something Europe tried to forget. But we're not forgetting. Stick around, because next we're stepping inside that royal nursery to see exactly how they bred an heir who was less king, more warning label. They tried to bury these secrets, but we're here to drag them into the light. But first, let's push open the door to that royal nursery. The one they draped in silk and incense to hide the stink of failure. Imagine the air. Hot, heavy with the smell of spilled milk turning sour in silver cups. Damp straw mattresses, rotting under velvet canopies. Candles burning down to blackened wicks as priests muttered Latin no one really believed would help. A daily horror show they tried to pass off as divine favor. Picture Spain's future in 1661. Madrid's Royal Alcazar. Charles II is born. Midwives crossing themselves so hard, they left bruises. His tongue too big to move right. Jaw jutting so far forward he couldn't even chew. Every feeding a choking hazard. They needed to tilt his head just so, praying he didn't asphyxiate on pap. They still called him His Most Catholic Majesty. Because if you pile enough holy titles on a child, maybe no one notices he couldn't stand without help until age 4. Think about that. An empire built on silver from the Americas. Armies marching across Europe. And at its center, a boy who needed servants to hold him upright so the crown wouldn't topple off. They crowned him in 1665. 4 years old. King, in ceremony. But in truth, a fragile, terrified child propped up as the last hope of a dying bloodline. You weren't supposed to see the priests flicking holy water at a kid gasping for breath. They called it a blessing. It smelled like panic. The hush of courtiers who realized they'd bet everything on a child who couldn't even form words properly. They don't want you to know this next part. As Charles aged, he didn't grow. He just got older. Ambassadors wrote back to Vienna and Paris in horror. One called him short, lame, epileptic, and senile. Another said he was so ugly as to cause fear. Not a prince. A human tax receipt for centuries of incest. Picture that throne room. Polished marble floors. Gold leaf everywhere. Velvet drapes drawn tight. And in the center, a monarch drooling on ermine trim, blinking at foreign envoys who pretended not to notice. Why the charade? Because the alternative was civil war. Losing the empire. Admitting they'd played God with marriage contracts so long, they created a boy who couldn't even sign them himself. They sold Europe a fairy tale, but they locked a tragedy behind the palace doors. Hard to believe? That's because they don't want you to. But it happened, and they tried to erase it from history. Don't go anywhere, because next, we're entering his court, where doctors tried bloodletting and exorcisms to cure inbreeding, and where priests debated whether Charles was cursed or just damned by his family's ambition. Because the real horror is only just beginning. But first, let's step into his court. Not the grand marble halls you see in paintings. I mean the back rooms, the sick rooms, the places they don't put on the guided tour. Imagine being a doctor in 1670, standing over the king's bed, breathing in the sour stench of unwashed linen, rotting food trays, the coppery smell of blood from repeated bleedings, holding your nose while you cut another vein, praying the humors would balance this time. They tried everything. Bloodletting, purges, enemas so frequent the court apothecary might as well have been a plumber. When that didn't work, they called exorcists. Priests chanting Latin while Charles screamed and drooled. Because obviously the real problem was demons, not the fact his family tree was a circle. Sound ridiculous? It was. But this was 17th century royal medicine. A toxic cocktail of religious fear and bad science. Foreign ambassadors watched in horror. Reports from the French envoy in 1676 described Charles as so feeble in mind and body that he seems unable to survive. Another wrote he was incapable of procreation or rule. A diplomatic way of saying, this kid is the final chapter of the Habsburg experiment in royal cousin marriage. But they kept going, because the alternative was chaos. If Charles died without an heir, the Spanish Empire would fracture. Austria, France, England, the Netherlands, all ready to fight over the scraps. So they doubled down. They married him to Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679, a political alliance they hoped would save them. Except she was terrified of him. Letters hint she spent her wedding night in tears, while courtiers whispered prayers for a miracle. Spoiler, no miracle came. Charles couldn't perform, couldn't even finish a sentence without slurring. By 1689, she was dead. Official cause? Melancholy. Unofficial cause? Being married to a man who drooled on her at dinner, while the empire waited for an heir that would never come. And they didn't stop there. They found him another wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1690. Same plan. New bride. More prayers. More failures. More desperate papal dispensations. Because they were so obsessed with keeping power in the family that they forgot the family was falling apart at the genetic seams. And you weren't supposed to know any of this. Because they polished the official portraits. They painted Charles in armor, sword at his side, gaze resolute. They didn't show the reality. A man so inbred he could barely speak or walk. Outrageous? Yeah. And they tried to bury it in state archives and flattering chronicles. But don't go anywhere, because next, we're going to watch the empire itself unravel. We'll see how Europe panicked at the idea of a king who couldn't even sign his name without help, and how generations of incest didn't just destroy one man. It burned a whole empire to the ground. If you're with me so far, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the secrets they didn't want you to know. But first, let's talk about the real panic. Not the kind in Charles's sick room, the kind in every throne room in Europe. Because this was a political nightmare. Imagine you're a French ambassador in 1690, sitting at court dinners trying not to gag at the smell of rotting teeth and spilled chamber pots, watching Charles II dribble wine down his chin, mouth too mangled to close, listening to his slurred orders while courtiers pretended they understood, writing home that Spain's mighty empire was ruled by a man who couldn't even stand without help. They didn't want you to know how scared they were, because if Charles died without an heir, Spain would splinter. France, Austria, England, they were all ready to pounce. An entire continent poised to eat itself alive. And it was all thanks to a century of marriages that would make a family reunion blush. Philip IV had married his own niece in 1649 to keep the Habsburg blood pure. It worked so well they did it again, and again, until there wasn't a single branch left on the family tree that wasn't twisted. By the 1690s, they were desperate. They needed Charles to father an heir, but he couldn't. He barely knew what was happening around him. They brought in doctors who suggested creative solutions, exotic aphrodisiacs, priests with holy relics pressed to his groin. Nothing worked. Marie-Louise died in 1689 without an heir. Maria Anna arrived in 1690. Same plan, same failures, same prayers whispered under portraits of saints who were probably rolling their eyes. Meanwhile, the empire was rotting. Silver shipments from the Americas slowed. Corruption exploded. Armies went unpaid. Revolts smoldered. Foreign powers circled like sharks. But the Habsburg court kept up the pageantry. Balls, feasts, processions, anything to distract from the smell of failure. They forced Charles onto balconies to wave at cheering crowds. A king so weak, he had to be propped up like a marionette, waving with a hand that shook like an old man's. Disturbing? Good. Because it's real. And they wrote polite letters home, describing him as melancholic, sensitive, or just unwell. They didn't say that this royal family was so inbred they couldn't speak or walk, because that would mean admitting the plan failed. They hid it behind ceremony. They called it divine right. They blamed witches, demons, anything except centuries of incest. And if you think this is dark, wait until you see what happened when Charles finally died. Because next, we'll watch the empire explode in a war that killed hundreds of thousands. All because they refused to admit they'd bred their king into a living corpse. But first, let's stand at that royal deathbed. Madrid, November honest, 1700. Candlelight flickering off dark tapestries. Priests chanting prayers, thick with fear. Because inbreeding was about to end the Habsburg line for good. Charles II was 39. He looked 80, emaciated, jaundiced, his mouth too ruined to close. Slobber soaking the bedsheets. He gasped. Final prayers he could barely form words for. And you know what they were really praying for? Not his soul, but a miracle heir. One last betrayal of biology. But there was nothing left. No children, no hope, no future. Just the end of Spain's most Catholic majesty, so broken he couldn't chew, walk, or even sign his own name without help. They called it God's will. Sure, God's will written in family marriage contracts, signed with papal approval. If you pay the right tithe, even the Pope will look at your niece and say, Amen. Because this wasn't just one man's tragedy. It was an empire's. When Charles died, Europe caught fire. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Hundreds of thousands dead, cities burned, armies crossing borders like fleas, all because one family couldn't stop marrying its cousins. They don't want you to know that part. They'd rather show you oil paintings of noble kings, polished coats of arms, genealogies trimmed to hide the incest. They call it heritage, legacy, a golden age. But if you peel back the varnish, you see the truth. A line so desperate to stay pure that they bred their heirs into husks. Heirs who couldn't speak or walk, who died drooling into embroidered pillows. Imagine being a peasant in Castile, hearing the bells toll for Charles's death. Not mourning, terrified, because the last king of the line had left nothing but civil war and foreign armies. And the Habsburgs, they kept lying even after he was dead. They dressed his corpse in royal robes, held a grand funeral with incense and chanting, the stench of his rotting body hidden by perfume. A final con on the people he left behind. Sound unbelievable? It should, but it happened, and they want you to forget it, because it ruins the fairy tale of God's chosen rulers. But you know it now. You know what they didn't want you to see. You can't unlearn it. So next time someone brags about noble bloodlines, about heritage and purity, remember Charles II, the king who couldn't speak or walk properly, Spain's last Habsburg, whose body was a battlefield lost before the war even started. If you want more of the history they tried to erase, like this video and subscribe. And when you're ready for even darker truths, click on this video to see the 5 most brutal deaths of royal women they really don't want you to know about.